G'day everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day. My name's Hamish Watson, and today we are going to be talking to you about application lifecycle management with SQL database in Fabric. And joining me today is Heidi Hastings. Heidi, do you want
Thanks,
to take it?
Hamish. I am super excited to be sharing the stage with my good buddy Hamish, the Make Stuff Go King. And as he said, we're going to be talking about the new SQL database in Fabric. I mean, we know and love SQL databases generally. I do want to point out, though, we say application lifecycle management. This one's probably more database lifecycle management, but we've been using this ALM term for quite some time now. And I should point out that we are absolutely live. So you are either watching us directly live right now in whatever time zone you're in. Hamish and I are both in the Southern Hemisphere. For those of you wondering, it's late in the day for us and probably very early in the morning for our futuristic buddy Hamish. And we are live. We're live and interactive. So please do put your questions in the chat. And we're very fortunate to have some awesome Microsoft people joining us in the chat as moderators. So they will try and address your questions, and anything they want to throw over to us, you will see us answering them. So please do ask us questions. Now, you've obviously joined this session, but hopefully you've joined some of the earlier sessions. But don't worry, you don't have to watch them all in order. It's recommended you watch the first one so you have a bit of an overview of what the getting to know this SQL database in Fabric specifically, because it's a little bit different to Azure SQL and SQL Server, but it is SQL. And then you would have seen the other sessions about different features that we enable within the SQL database. And now we're going to talk about how we're going to manage the life cycle of that SQL database within Fabric, because it's kind of one of these same, but different exercises. And of
Hey,
course, don't
Heidi.
miss the very last session. Oh, what
No,
are you going
no,
to tell us, Hamish?
no, you do your bit, and then I've got something to say, mate.
Excellent. Don't miss the last session because that's all about query tuning and performance. Now, everyone knows that query tuning and performance is an art. It is a science. It takes effort, energy, but it is same, but different. So make sure you tune into that session so you see the nuances that work with the SQL database specifically in Fabric.
What I was going to say, mate, was you kind of triggered me before when you said database lifecycle management, and I was thinking, there's so much time and effort being put into this whole ALM stuff. What about analytics lifecycle management? I don't know.
Oh,
We might get in trouble. We'll probably never be asked to present again because we're totally going off script. But
but I don't
whatever.
know because we've got CD and that's continuous delivery, continuous deployment. So why not turn ALM into analytics lifecycle management?
You heard it here first, folks.
I like
ALM
it.
analytics
Coining a
lifecycle
new term. And it fits
management.
well with Fabric. It's an analytics software as a service platform. Although
Absolutely.
I did see in the earlier sessions, now that we have the SQL database, it's gone from being an analytics only software as a service platform to now a data platform, because we're talking operational data, we're talking analytic data, we're talking data science, we've got machine learning, we got, all the things wrapped into it.
We're bringing
But
it.
why not hang out with like-minded people like yourselves, watching these sessions, learning all about the Fabric SQL database? You can hang out in person in Las Vegas. This is the second time they're running this in the US. First time was this year. Second time is going to be next year. It is March 31 through to April 2nd. It includes workshops, which means hands-on labs. It means directly talking to product teams. It means talking to community around the world, getting to learn about the different features, everything from real-time insights, lakehouse, database, data science, all the things, data engineering. It is still a chance to take use of this discount code. It has a limitation, so if you want to use it, try and use it as early as possible in the hope that you can still get 150, and I believe it's 150 US, which is
Boom.
great for us in other regions because the currency conversion the other way is all right.
Yeah.
So do check that out. Go to the QR code, go to the AKMS FabricCon 25 Vegas. It's an opportunity to meet people who work on the product directly. So the PMs that get to create the vision and execute with the engineering teams. It's a great way to meet the customer advisory teams who support all the different customers around the globe. You can meet some of the different people, cloud solution architects. They're very friendly, very knowledgeable, and they always want to talk to customers. They want to hear what you're learning, and you get the opportunity to not only interact with them, but interact with the community that comes around Fabric. It is a global community. Multiple regions will be at this particular event. So if you have the opportunity to take a bit of time off from the day job, and go to this event. I highly recommend getting to it. I kind of really want to go, don't you, Hamish?
I do. I do.
Now, let's get into some serious content. We are going to jam pack this session. So, we thought before we get into the ALM, we better just remind you what we're going to talk about. We're talking about Fabric SQL database. So, it's different to things like data engineering, lakehouse, and warehouse, but we do have some overlap in what we're doing in terms of the client tooling, the functionality, the feature set. But we're specifically talking about this operational database. So it's not the one that's backed by the Delta Parquet files like Lakehouse and Warehouse. It's for your operational workloads. We're talking operational in terms of, say, metadata storage, control databases, but we're also talking about applications. Even though your application itself may be deployed to another platform like Azure App Service, you can have it backed by a database inside Fabric, which now means we can enable you to use the Fabric compute to serve those operational workloads. It's shifting the cost profile from Azure over to Fabric. And because it's all in the Fabric ecosystem, we can leverage all these awesome, powerful features. We've got visualizations, we've got data engineering, we've got activation from our data, we can do alerting. It is amazing, but it's that operational SQL database. So now that you remember, just jog in your memory from that first session. We're talking about databases. Now, let's talk about how we're going to manage them, Hamish, because I know you love CI/CD. Let's clue the people in on what you've been
Yeah.
doing like forever and a day.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, I'm really excited to be part of this ALM session, whatever ALM will stand for in the future, because it gives me an opportunity to actually talk about something near and dear to my heart, which is basically DevOps, right? And so we are bringing CI/CD, or continuous integration, continuous delivery, through to the whole Fabric ecosystem. So suddenly I can join the party, hang out with all my mates that are doing all this crazy, wondrous things within the Fabric ecosystem. And more importantly, I can help them make stuff go within it. So, I mean, looking at, you will have seen, this sort of diagram. I've taken it off the Microsoft website, so no trademarks are at risk here. But if we look at sort of the application or analytics lifecycle, right throughout its, planning, development, delivery, and operation phases, each phase, has to rely on all those other phases. We can't do one without the other. And, the really cool thing for me is when I talk about DevOps, which encompasses CI/CD, it involves all of these roles in each of these phases to some extent. Now, if we are talking about continuous integration, right? This is the process where we're automatically building, testing code every time a team member is committing those code changes to version control. And now that Fabric, integrates with both Azure DevOps in terms of Git repositories there and GitHub repositories, it means that, we are bringing a whole heap of culture of collaboration to our analytics platform. And so part of that, right, is we're going to create our workflows. We're going to work with different versions, right? So those versions are all going to be stored in source control. And we're going to code and collaborate with others on that code. Being able to codify what we do in Fabric is an absolute game changer. And I'm so excited that we're here. And of course, we can automate the tasks that we are doing right throughout our continuous integration phase. But of course, once we've done all this really cool stuff, we move into continuous delivery or continuous deployment. And so continuous delivery is the process of automating the deployment and delivery from our build phase right through our different environments up to our production environment. And so, we talk about release pipelines that can create, multiple environments that will automate the, creation and deployment of whatever it is we're doing within Fabric. And the fact that we're now doing SQL databases within Fabric is, it's joy to my heart. So anyway, now that we've done an intro to Fabric and CI/CD, let's talk about some of the goals of what we're doing within CI/CD.
Oh, I love the first one. every database under source control. You know, we've had databases all over the place from SQL Server to Azure SQL and now Fabric SQL. And if you hadn't spotted already, the database project's available for Lakehouse and Warehouse within Fabric. So I just love this particular motto is like we want every database under source control. We want to make sure organizations have that protection that source control offers. It allows us to have the versioning so we know what's changing over time. It allows us to quickly back up a change. It allows us to work on different features at different times and roll them out to different environments in a controlled way. But it means we have that protection available to us. That is what I would love to see happening in the world.
And of course, one of the tenets around true DevOps is the fact that, self-service, right? Allowing our development teams to actually be able to spin up what they need and, more importantly, tear it down to, keep costs down and whatever. But the fact that some of the foundational parts of what, myself, I've been doing CI/CD since 2010, 2011, and being able to now do that within Fabric ecosystem means that some of our development teams, right, database developers, analytics people, are sort of being left out of the party. Well, they're now in, and we're doing some of those really cool things where they don't have to go and talk to someone and raise a ticket and all these horrid manual tasks that just slow stuff down. Self-service is where it's at.
I love this one, although I wouldn't necessarily say without learning a new tool, because I'm conscious of the people who've come to Fabric from that analytical background. They might not have ever used the database projects, they might not have ever opened a Management Studio or Azure Data Studio. However, what we're trying to do is give you a seamless tool set so you can work with the same tools that you're working with other database technologies within Microsoft. So instead of having to do a different tool for every different item you're using in Fabric, or every different Microsoft product you're using in the data family. Now we have this low friction mechanism where it's like, hey, we realize you're going to work with Azure SQL databases in some data platforms. You're going to work with Fabric SQL databases in others. Let's give you consistent tools. And the fact that we can introduce code quality checks. I mean, think about it. The ability to check if someone's modifying a database code, they're modifying that DDL, and they want to look at that and go, hey, if I change this view, have all the references in that view, are they legit? Are they existing? Or if someone deletes a table, we can suddenly see that all these views and store procs and functions start to break just by doing builds. So we're protecting ourselves from all our changes breaking the different kings. So that those code quality checks, or even just standards, using code linting to go, hey, is this in the correct naming convention, the casing standard, the commas in the right place? Oh, controversial commas in the right place. But these are the things we can do with these code quality checks. Like, hello, and onboarding a new team member, so easy. It's a tool set the whole team knows. I love it.
Absolutely. And the really cool thing is, and Heidi, you just sort of touched on it, is that keeping the integration points open into and out of the Fabric ecosystem means that those more advanced CI/CD tools and workflows, we can plug them in. And so now it just totally allows us to use industry standard checks and balances across our deployment pipeline. So yeah, really, I don't know. There's few things that I've been excited in my career about that I feel like are game changers, but bringing this to Fabric is for me a massive game changer, and I'm absolutely looking forward to helping people with it.
Totally. Now, how do you get started? So you've seen with Fabric broadly, you can edit it inside the service, so inside your browser. So the ALM is no different. First sort of citizen services is that inside the Fabric service, when you're in a workspace, we can attach that workspace to a Git repository in either Azure DevOps or GitHub. Now, with that, it means our Fabric SQL database does join the list of supported items, so we can check in changes to that database directly into our source control all through the browser. So if you think about that, you're going into Fabric, you go into the Fabric SQL database, you can add a new table and quickly put that into source control and do iterative development, but you can also see the history over time. So if we look at a bit of a walkthrough of that specific scenario, if we start with, say, our Messaging DB app, in this case, Messaging DB8, you see them on the screen. Now let's look at it more closely. If we take that Messaging DB app on the next slide, we'll take that app and we'll take the database, I should say, that has an app with it. We'll take the database, we're going to make some changes, and we've committed them to source control. Now we can go over to our source control repository, which if you've never seen Azure DevOps, this is an example of Azure DevOps. With the source control commit and sync, it's going to take all our Fabric SQL database, transfer that into individual SQL files per object and a database project file, put that into the repository, and then give us a commit message with our commit hash and all the history. So as we make changes over time, you can see there we can see the history of changes over on the Azure DevOps side. And the same goes for GitHub as well. You're probably thinking you want to bring your own. They enable you to bring your own by having this database project, but the direct integrations with the Fabric workspace are, of course, GitHub and Azure DevOps.
Why would you want to use anything else anyway?
You never know. Some people are on different journeys. That's why we have these database projects, right? So with the database project, so if you've never seen a database project before, it's available to you in Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code, Azure Data Studio, and of course you can open it up in a notepad editor if you really feel like it. You just can't do a build through that. With the database project, we have one file per object. So that's a database object. So if we have a table or we have a stored procedure or we have a function. Now indexes, even though they're their own object, they sit with the table they're attached to. So anything like primary and foreign keys and indexes will go in the table defined file. Views will have their own file. And these are defined as create statements. So it's a series of create statements across a series of files that when we bundle them all together into a database project, we can then build the database project, which takes care of checking all the referential integrity. It means we can visualize the entire database structure. We can either work with it in T-SQL form, or we can work with it in more like table designer editor style things. And then we can also take that and use it in the different products. And once we've built it, it turns it into a DAC pack. And we know that with DAC packs, we can deploy that in a number of different ways. So with this database project now, if we weren't using the direct service integration and we decided to create a database project from our Fabric SQL, we could check it into any other Git repository or any other repository type. You may be using Visual Studio Team Services, prior versions of Azure DevOps, and put it in TFVC repository for all we know. But with this now, I want to point out, this slide shows the pre and post deployment script because the pre and post deployment script are a possibility with the database project. So when we publish from this project, it will take the pre-deployment script and run that first, then the DAC pack deploy, then the post deployment script. But with Fabric SQL, those two features, the pre and post deployment script, are not yet supported. And that makes sense because if we're working directly in the Fabric SQL database in the browser, we're working with the objects. We don't see the pre and post deployment script. We could, of course, have them in the project, but we won't use them against the Fabric SQL database. But you can use them with other flavors of SQL. But as I saw in the chat, this is the Fab SQL, the fabulous SQL, because it's Fabric SQL. So now let's dive into that a bit further. And I know, Hamish, you're keen to take us through what do these database projects do for us in VS Code Visual Studio world?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Heidi. Yeah, so basically, you can develop in client tools, right? So, we mentioned VS Code or Visual Studio, and from the get-go within them, within VS Code, I can create a new branch in source control. I will copy down or clone the code to my local machine and work on it there. It allows me to edit and build, the SQL database project in VS Code with MS SQL, and of course SQL database projects extensions. And of course, from VS Code, I can connect to Fabric or even use a local instance for testing, right? Now, I use VS Code, but as mentioned, you can use Visual Studio as well. I like VS Code because it's lightweight enough for me to be able to use it, wherever I am, be it on a Mac, Windows, whatever. But Now that we had a quick look at the tooling, let's actually get into and have a look at some of what we can do with our Fabric workspaces, being able to check in to them and also update them from source control. So for this one, for source control setup, we're going to take our primary Fabric workspace, which where we have a proof of concept project that we're going to use. We're going to create an empty Git repository. And again, that can be in Azure DevOps or GitHub. And of course, we're going to connect our workspace that we're working in to the main branch of the repo. Now, as a true DevOpsologist, I would say, you know, maybe don't use main. You might want to use some form of alternate branch, depending on, you know, your branching strategy or policy. Personally, I would probably use a feature branch, work along there, and then use, you know, the usual source control methodologies of merging that into main. But that's just me. I feel triggered to say it, but yeah, use whichever branching strategy you have within where you work. Alrighty, Heidi, let's go through this in action.
Let's do it. Now, totally right there, Hamish. But we also understand, everyone, you're on a journey. So get your stuff in source control first, then head on to CI/CD. So in this case, we've got an Azure DevOps repo. It's an initialized repo because you have to make sure that you've already got the Git repo initialized. We go into the Fabric workspace. We configure the Git integration. We're going to select the different properties. So for Azure DevOps, we have the organization, the project, the Git repository, the branch, and the folder. Now you'll notice we set the folder. You're probably wondering why. In this case, we have multiple solutions in this one repo. So we're going to put the Fabric SQL database into a folder, which means we can have other workspaces in other folders in the same Git repository if we wanted. If we're doing enterprise solutions that go across workspaces, we might want to manage them in the same repo. Once we've connected, now this is going to connect. You would have seen it's already logged in. It's using the account that's logged into the service. So we can't actually switch to another domained Azure DevOps. So make sure you're logging into Azure DevOps for the same domain as what you're logged into the service with. It'll go ahead and sync. When it's syncing, it's taking the Fabric SQL database, generating those SQL files for every single object, putting it into a SQL project. So the SQL project has a reference to all those objects, and then committing it into the Git repository. With the source control button on a workspace, we can see the source control, but we can also navigate to the Azure DevOps repository. And so now you'll see here, we've got all these different folders. The one we want is the one for our Fabric SQL database. We can see all our SQL files, and you'll see right down the bottom, there's the SQL project as well. And you can see we've got the DDL in the form of a create statement and the history that we committed the files to the repository. So we can seamlessly go between the two environments. We can go from the workspace into the Azure DevOps repository to have a look at what we committed in the history. In the same way, we can go into the workspace and say source control, and we can see if it's got changes and we can commit them.
And also, more importantly, I feel happy because we didn't commit to main branch. I just had to say it.
Me, because our databases are in source control.
I know, right? And this within all the other things that we are committing to source control. So that's marvelous.
Exactly,
Alrighty.
but this was just the start. This is just getting it in there, but we know there's a heap of scenarios like how do you do parallel development? How do we work offline, online? How do we sync? How do we put changes back and forth? So I know, Hamish, you're going to take us through some scenarios now.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the left-hand side, we've got our workspace, right? We've called it Session Finder. In the middle there, we've got our source code. And on the right-hand side, VS Code, right? So that's where I'm going to be deploying locally. So from within Fabric, I can commit all the things that I had created before this whole, you know, ALM thing had come along. Well, I can commit those to source control. I then can pull them down to my local machine, observe, work on them locally, make some cool changes, push it back up to source control, and update our actual workspace within Fabric, which is absolutely brilliant and exciting. And the cool thing is, I mean, this is things that are very typical of what people are doing, be it deploying to app services, deploying to Azure SQL database, and now deploying to Fabric. And for me, I have to state that this is a bridge bringing development teams, bringing operational teams, bringing everyone together in terms of being able to collaborate with the same tooling right throughout our deployment pipeline to make those changes in Fabric. So what we're going to do here is we're going to make a change in our service and we're going to commit it to the repository. So within our workspace, we now have our tables and everything that are defined. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create this table here, sessions feedback, again, within Fabric. And we're going to look at, within our repository, we don't have that here yet. So we're all synced up. So let's look at our changes. And what this does is this is doing a sync between what we have in Fabric and what we have over in source control. And so this does take a couple of minutes just to sync between the two of them. Lo and behold, we do have some changes. And what we've done was we'd added our session feedback table. So we're now committing to source control within Fabric. We haven't left Fabric. And I guess that's something to consider here, is that you could have teams making these changes from within Fabric. They may not want to use VS Code. I do. They might not. And so what now happens is, boom, we've got this over, we've got the history, and here's our table, right, that we had created in Fabric and is now in source control and now being able to be collaborated on. So Heidi, tell me how I can do this stuff locally.
Yeah. So with the local, the thing we're going to do with that, we're going to walk you through it. So the first thing we need to do is take that remote Git repository and clone it down into our local area. So back on our laptop, our desktop, whichever machine we're working from. Once we've cloned that locally, we then open up the database project. Now we see here that it's a database project, so we can use the database project within VS Code Azure Data Studio to render it in a more database project world. So we're looking at it more navigating database objects as if we would with other client tools, Management Studio. We then build it to make sure that the code we've got is valid. So it's doing all those referential integrity checks and letting us know that each object is valid. There's some warnings about unresolved references, but nothing that's going to block us from doing a deployment. We're then going to make, some changes here. We're going to switch and do the .NET build, which is kind of cool. It's something they introduced in the last couple of years. We can .NET build this project, which is amazing. And once we've done that, we can actually go make a change to one of these objects. So we're making this change locally inside our client tools. We're not doing it remote. We're not doing it inside the Fabric service. So it's not actually modifying any of those. So it means we've got the safety of making changes without affecting everyone else in the team or any other solution that we might have running. So in this case, we're going to go into the sessions area. We'll have a look at some different stored procs here, but then we'll switch into sessions. And we're going to add an additional field. We're going to make a change. Look at that, typing at the speed of light. We had a review time, and you'll notice the review time that we had is actually a date time too, which is interesting. And you notice Copilot in the background is kind of giving us a bit of a hint that the date time 2 is going to have a precision of 7. We can add a foreign key as well. And because we're doing these changes, before we finish them, we're going to actually do a build. So here you notice we didn't put the schema in. So I just want to point those two things out, daytime 2 and schema, because it's going to come up in our next video. We build it again. We notice that the build is successful. We have some warnings, but warnings are okay. Errors are bad. We need to resolve errors. Warnings we need to check. Then we're going to put that into source control. So we're going to commit our changes back to the repository. That's our local one. And then we're going to push those changes up to the remote one. But again, we're still outside of Fabric at this point. We haven't actually integrated back into the Fabric world. So now we go to our repository. This is our remote one. So this is the Azure DevOps. We'll now see that it also has the change. Let's try and get it back into Fabric, shall we, Hamish?
Yeah, absolutely. Alrighty. So what we have here is we've pushed it up to our remote repository. We've got the history and auditing and all those great things that we want. So now let's sync up our workspace. Hey, there's a change. We've got an update. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring that back because we know what the change is. Now let's update. And so this is now bringing that update that was made in the remote source control and bringing it into our Fabric workspace. By the way, I love the fact that we do a build before we do anything because, you know, in the olden days, friends don't let friends right click and publish. Always do a build. I had to, right? I'm sorry. Because we've called it ALM, I feel like I've got to do DevOps jokes from like 2009, 2010. But anyway, again, we are syncing across. So this is not, instantaneous. It's about a minute or two. While we're bringing those objects in and we're doing a whole heap of work, there's some really exciting things going on in the background. The fact also is that you can see a whole heap of other things, the different types of things that we can actually sync between Fabric and source control. Now, some of them are unsupported. The data flow one at the top is not. That's okay. The really cool thing is almost, week by week, more things are being supported. Okay, here we have it. And as before, it's a create statement. Now, there's a couple of things at play here. We've got date time 2, and it's got the right precision. So that checking, all that checking stuff, it was sitting there, syncing away. Well, not to ruin the surprise, but let's have a look. Heidi, what has changed?
Well, this is some of the nuances. So once we are using those client tools and we're publishing into the Fabric SQL area, we need to make sure when we sync those back. So when we publish up and we've synced into Fabric, Fabric's gone, hey, these are some minor little changes we need to make for this to be compatible. And then once we make those changes, it will then reflect them back. So if we sync in reverse and we say, hey, Fabric SQL change to Azure DevOps, we now see that it's recognized that actually that date time 2 is actually daytime 2 with precision 7. And the fact that we're referencing a foreign key, it was in the sessions table. It's gone and clarified that that's in the DBO schema, which I think is really important because we want our references to include the schema. 2-part naming is great. 3-part naming, 2-part naming, yes. So you can see here, this is that inline compare. And this is just with changes we've been doing syncing between the two. If you think about changes you've made to a database over like a year, 2 years, 3 years, 6 years, whatever the case may be, and you look at the history, you can see your changes like this. So you can start to see, hey, over all the different feature releases we've been doing, we have added columns, we've changed data types. You're doing some production support BAU, and someone says, hey, when did this column change type? You can see that. Or if someone's working on a Power BI report and they suddenly notice they've got an error in their Power Query looking at this Fabric SQL data, we can look and go, there was a change made. That change was part of this release. This release was to implement this feature or make this change. So we need to make sure all the impacted components are updated at the same time. But we now have that capability all through a few clicks.
Yeah,
Super cool.
absolutely. The first time I watched what was going on in these demos, I got triggered. I was a DBA for 15 years, and I was like, wait a second, why are they removing DBO? Because look, people, this is a free one. If you want any of your SQL Server databases to go really well, your queries to go really well, please use schema.table. It means that SQL's not doing some unnecessary work. So there's a little performance tuning tip for you. Anyway, there is a whole heap of benefits that we get from integrating with source control. And so what we have, again, is we have our workspace. We are committing to our remote source control. We can bring that down. We can push the changes and update them. this is what we were talking about before, but it really comes home to roost where we can review our changes in a collaborative environment, right? And we can now bring in code quality checks with this methodology. Now, on the left-hand side, we do have the history of changes by object, and these are low friction deployments. And so when I looked back, years ago when I first started using Fabric, a lot of it was clicking around and that. Well, you can't scale clicking and you can't scale people, but we can definitely scale and do auditing and quality checks on code. So anyway, I've talked a whole heap about collaborative stuff. So let's have a look at what we can do around multi-workspace deployment pipelines. And this is basically between environments, right? So dev, test, prod. I will have to say that what we see as data pipelines, that's not the same as deployment pipelines. These are two different things. Alrighty. So what we have here is a nice little animation around our deployment pipelines. And what it does is it allows us to take our different workspaces and start deploying those changes, right? So multi-workspace deployment process. And it's so brilliant because we can automate the deployment between our dev, our test, and prod. And as you can see here, we've got some changes in our test environment. We're going to push them over to our production environment because we've developed them, we've done all the testing, and boom, one click, deploy to production. And the great thing about this is it adheres to that wonderful tenet of CI/CD, which is repeatable deployments. And again, we can't do that with humans, but we can do it with code. So this is all great, but wait, it even gets better because we can now bring our own pipelines to this ecosystem. Using SQL package, we can start actually doing codification of how we're going to deploy out to Fabric, which I think is amazing. Now, there is a few little setup things we got to do. We do have to do some setup for connecting Azure DevOps pipelines through to our Azure subscription, and that's all cool. And within Azure, we do need to register an app. So, this is nothing really new to us. And then what we do is we then manage the identity of our SQL database. And so again, we'll take that app registration that we have set up, and now we can incorporate this into our pipelines. And so what we're doing here is we can now use our publish action within Azure DevOps pipelines, and we can generate that DAC file and then publish it out to our Fabric workspace. And so this for me is where we're bringing in automation to the next level in terms of our deployments as part of ALM. So Heidi, tell us about CI/CD ecosystem.
So I know we've got some Power BI folks in the chat as well. So I want to just point out a few things as we go through this. So when we're in Fabric, we've got two different ways to look at it. We've got the tooling and we've got how we're going to do our development deployment life cycles, right? How we're going to manage those changes. So in Fabric, we can do workspace commit. So let's say we're working on a solution that's a Power BI report against a Fabric SQL database. We can use that workspace to check into and update to our source control. So we can check in and out from our Azure DevOps or our GitHub, and we can be committing changes over time. And then when we want to deploy those to our next environment, we can use the multi-workspace deployment pipeline because we're using the Fabric deployment pipeline. The Fabric deployment pipeline supports most of the Fabric items and all of, or almost all of, the Power BI items. So we can deploy both our Power BI report, semantic dataset, and our Fabric SQL database together across those different dev, test, prod, and any other environment, pre-prod, QA, DR, whatever environment space you want. So we can use those two features and stay all within the service. But if we want to leverage outside of Fabric, but still client integrated tools that natively work with them, we can clone those repositories down. We can use things like VS Code and Visual Studio and Azure Data Studio to make changes to the Fabric SQL database. We can use Power BI Desktop to make changes in the PBIP report. We can commit all those into our various repositories within Azure DevOps and GitHub. And then for the Fabric SQL, we can use SQL package to do that deployment. But we can bundle that with deploying other solutions, whether that be Fabric pipelines, Fabric notebooks, it may be Power BI reports and semantic models. We can still use all those with the Azure DevOps deployments and the GitHub deployments. So we can do that, bring your own. So if you want to use those advanced features, or you want to roll your own solutions, or you want to work across different areas, we could have a Azure App Service web app that we're deploying that works with our Fabric SQL database. We may be working with the Fabric AI skills space and combining that with the Fabric SQL database. So we can use the different features that our team works with. And it's really cool because it means you can either use the features that are appropriate for your team, or if you're a new Greenfields team and you're brand new to it, you can just start in the service and work with all the service features, sort of that single pane of glass that we always love, not having to go, context switch between different tooling. And then as we advance through and we find, hey, actually, we'd like to use code quality checking, we can shift out into those more outside Fabric advanced features, but we can use the two. So use what's appropriate for your team and what's appropriate for what you're developing, all in the one ecosystem. But there's more CI/CD we want to share with them, isn't there, Hamish? There's always more.
There's always more. So we want to do some end-to-end deployment stuff. And so again, I talked about we have our workspace for our session finder app. And part of that is we are using the deployment pipeline. We're pushing through to our test workspace as we saw before. But let's say that we're happy with everything. We're then going to commit to our source control, right? So the remote one, which again just opens up what we can do. And more importantly, it gives us that source of truth of those changes, right? So now we have them locked there and we can start doing some things. So let's have a look at a pipeline deployment.
We love pipeline deployments. So we're going to start off by creating a new workspace. This workspace is going to be for our test environment, right? So we're going to have a test environment. You called this user acceptance, system testing, whatever the case may be, test. We're going to go back to our original workspace because from that workspace, we're going to define our deployment. So we're going to go here, we're going to create a deployment pipeline. With this deployment pipeline, we get the ability to define how many environments we want to work with in the pipeline. So we're just going to do a basic dev test prod, and we need to assign what workspaces are representative of dev, of test, and of production. So we go ahead and initialize the pipeline, and we assign our dev workspace, the one we've been developing in, the original workspace, to that development slot. It indicates that we've got some unsupported things, so it's nice enough to warn us of what's supported and not. Always check back, that changes all the time. Now we're going to associate that new test workspace with the test environment. We're going to leave production. We're going to compare. So we'll notice that when we go to the development environment, the test environment doesn't yet have these. So you can see we've got this only in source, which means only in the environment to the left. So in the dev environment, we have objects that aren't in test. We can then pick what items we want to deploy. So in this case, we're going to deploy everything that is supported. We're going to type an awesome friendly message. Always put comments because it'll help future self find out why you did a deployment. It might be feature branch X. It might be, we're doing rollout of major version 5, minor version 4, and we're going to deploy those changes. It's going to take just the DDL of our Fabric SQL. So it's not going to bring the data with it. It's only going to bring the definitions. So it's going to take our Fabric SQL database. It's going to deploy that into the test environment. It's going to also give us that default SQL Analytic endpoint that comes with all our SQL. And we're also going to get the default semantic model that we won't need to worry about in this case. But it's going to put that in our test environment. We see a status as it's going along. So as it's creating each object, it's going to put it in that bottom window so we can see how it's progressing over time. you also get the nice little notification button up the top that you can see deployment in progress. Once it's worked through all the different items, of course, the unsupported ones, it will leave alone. The supported ones, it'll bring across. So this is pretty cool because you think about it, if we've got an ETL process using Fabric Factory, Fabric pipelines, putting data into our Fabric SQL database, those will get deployed together so we can make changes to the two. And once it's deployed, we can navigate straight into it from the deployment pipeline and check. So we can see, have we got our sessions table in there? Yes, we do. Have we got our speakers table? Yeah, we do. And if we look at it, we can see that we are looking at the test environment. This isn't integrated directly with Git. It's deploying it via that Fabric deployment pipeline. And we can connect to it with our SQL endpoint if we like. So it's still doing those final little touches, but once it's finished, it will let us know that either it's successfully deployed it or not. But you can see now it's finished, successfully deployed. Yes.
Nice.
By the way, there is an undo button. So if you make changes in Fabric and you want to undo, we didn't point it out, but when you do the commit, there's a nice little undo button next to it. So if someone in your team just decides to make changes in the service that you're like, maybe we don't want to keep those, you can just go in and hit undo on that source control window to revert back to the version from source control.
Nice.
Takes me down.
Alrighty. So what we're going to do here is we're going to make a change, right? So within our service. And so looking at our table here, what we're going to do is we're going to add in another column, right? So dietary restrictions, we'll add that into our speaker profile. And so we are doing that within this workspace. And of course, if we go to our development one, you'll see here that we don't have that column. So what we're going to do here is we see that we have differences from source. And so this is where we can choose where we're going to deploy this to. And so just wait for it to load.
Are we going to get a schema compare, Hamish?
We are.
Is this a schema compare?
It is a schema
inside the service?
I know, right? Like how long did we have to wait for that to come to SQL Server or Azure SQL? Boom, here it is, which is awesome. So we can see the differences between our workspaces, right? Between our sessions database in one workspace versus the other one. And we can take those changes, we add the column, right? And we're now deploying that out. So you see there, we are deploying from development, that drop-down list next to the deploying button, which is lit up. But again, this is enabling us to keep our environments in sync so that we have basically prod-like environments as we are going through our whole deployment pipeline, right? So end to end, which for me, again, is an amazing part of what ALM is going to do within Fabric. So now if we look, we now have it there within our database. Now, what we need to do is obviously push that to source control because we're now happy. And so we, again, will give a nice commentary message and then commit that to source control so that as, you know, other people are collaborating on all of these changes means that they will be able to bring down, you know, pull those changes down. And there we have it, right? So in source control, we have that dietary restrictions column that's been added. So again, adhering to some of the tenets of continuous integration. Alrighty, so let's have a look at this. So on the left-hand side, I've got my VS Code, I'm working locally. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull down or clone the latest code from source control. I'm then going to make my changes and then I'm going to build, right? So I'm going to be using SQL package to do my build, and then I'm going to deploy or publish that out to my dev environment. So once it's successfully built, once it's been successfully had some other checks and balances, because again, we can do those quality checks within our continuous integration build phase, right? We publish it out. And then if we're really happy with what we've found in dev, from the get-go, we can deploy and publish. Now, I would like to point out that we can actually use a whole heap of automation tools around this, right? And so again, it's bringing the true CI/CD that we've been using in industry for 15 odd years. Now it's foundational within Fabric and SQL databases. And of course, once this is all done and we're happy and all the tests have passed and everything, we'll then push those changes back up. Now, there's some other processes around this, right? Because we may be on a feature branch, so we might do a pull request, get someone to review it, all those nice things. We might have some automated gate checks, etc., that do a whole heap of checks before we actually merge it into main, because we're going to be deploying our production system from our main branch as a general rule. And so the more checks and balances we can put in through automation, not manual tasks, so much the better, right? So that when we do deploy out to production, we know that all those checks have been done. Alrighty, let's have a look at that in action. Where you go, Heidi?
Let's race through this video. So in this video, we're going to take what we had in that remote repository. We're going to clone it locally. We're going to build it. So we've got our local clone now. We're going to make sure we pull down all the changes from the Azure DevOps repository. We're going to make sure that we have what we're expecting to have in the various tables we're working with. So we can see here, we're working with the speakers table. We're going to remove our unique clustered because we don't need that anymore. Once we've built this, we're then going to publish this up to the service. So as we edit through, we're going to put a different index in this case, because we've decided instead of unique, we're going to do a non-clustered. We go into our database project. We make sure we build it from the database project. So we're getting that referential integrity check. No warnings. Warnings, no errors. And then we can go ahead and publish that out to the service. So we got our DAC pack now. We can do the publish. Now you can do publishing through the terminal window. We can right-click publish. And interestingly, when you right-click publish, even though we know things as Fabric, you're going to select SQL Server as your target. So it's going to say, you want to deploy it to a SQL Server. Yes, we do. We know this as Fabric SQL or Fab SQL. And don't forget, we are live and there's a lot of content we've been trying to show you. So as this goes through and does the publish, we know that not all your questions may be answered. So we want to make sure that when you see the last couple of slides, there's the community around Fabric, Fabric SQL, SQL Server, Azure Data, Data Family, the whole box and dice, this global community around it. So make sure that we want to hear your questions. So do visit the link that you'll see appear throughout the video. Go to that community site, raise your questions. Sometimes they might need a little bump to remind people that they're there, but often you'll get responses all times of the day. So we've gone ahead, and when we want to publish this, it's important when we go to the Fabric SQL database, we get the correct connection string. So we'll get the server address with the 1433 URL. And a little tidbit, that Fabric SQL database has a GUID on the end with the connection string. So make sure you don't just use the name that you see in the service. Actually go into the little gear icon and get the connection property. So you make sure you get that extra little bit of spice. That'll make sure you're connecting to the database. And if you click the SQL Analytics endpoint, you'll get a different connection string. So make sure you're using the SQL one. Ooh, and look at that. Deployment is done. We've created our index. This is the other thing we get. We get all the details about what it's deploying. It says it's doing an initial deployment. It's updating these specific objects. It's deployed this new object. And when we go into the service, we'll see that object exist. But I think we've seen this time and time again, Hamish. So I think we should see them actually do the deployment now. Let's take it from dev to test. because we know what the connection tree is. Look at that.
And again, this can be, once we've done this, we can fold this into Azure DevOps in terms of pipelines, and of course GitHub Actions. Because using SQL package, we can use it across whatever build or delivery tool we want to use. Brilliant.
Ta-da!
There we go.
And I know some people asked about things like, if you're creating a query in SSMS and then you're loading it into Power Query for Power BI, sure, you can create the query in the Fabric service against the Fabric SQL database, or you can use SSMS, Azure Data Studio, to write the same query against the Fabric SQL. Once you're happy with it, transition it into the Power Query for Power BI Desktop to query Fabric SQL. Which is pretty cool.
Alrighty. Cool. Well, look, apologies, we're a bit short on time. We got so excited about all this great content we've got to get to you, but we still want to hear your questions. So please visit the link scrolling at the bottom of your screen and, post your questions for us to answer after the show. We're going to be happy to answer those. Also, we've gathered several resources that may answer your questions, which are at the link on this slide, so aka.ms/SQL on Fabric/more. So please go have a look at the resources, and we'll check out some of those questions, and appreciate you all coming along. Heidi,
One
what's
extra
next?
thing. Before we go into this, I know we're super close to time, but if you're looking to learn more and this is all new to you, or you're looking to transition from being, say, a Power BI developer into data engineering, or a DBA over into data analytics, check out the Learn modules. We have Learn modules for end-to-end walkthroughs on real-time insights, on Fabric SQL database, on Fabric pipelines, on Dataflow Gen 2, integrations between all those different things. You can even look at the data science. There are Learn modules for all of this. So aka.ms/learn. Look at Fabric. You will see all the different workloads or features within Fabric. Often they have a Learn module. And then often there's an end-to-end tutorial series as well that takes you from different personas across into these new found enablements with Fabric. And if you're using Power BI Premium, you're lucky that you get transitioned over to Fabric. So you can pretty closely use these features pretty soon. So do check them out. And thanks for tuning in and watching us. And for those of you watching the recording, like Hamish said, check out these different modules. Go through them. You don't have to do these ones in order. Recommend doing the first one first, though, and then the other ones in any order appropriate to you. But check out the last session, developer-centric query and performance monitoring. This is in 2 time zones. One, the same time zone you're watching now. The other one in PDT time zone for more US-based folks. So definitely check these out. Keep asking questions. Jump in the chat. You'll see the different links that have been made available to you. Join the community that's available to you. Check out the Fabric communities worldwide, user groups near you. There's ones near me and Hamish. We run them.
Yes, but wait, there's one big community thing you should check out.
Yes. FabCon. If you ever wanted to meet the product team in person, this is an event to do. You want to meet your community that's using the products, this is the event for you. If there's any event you want to attend that is Fabric specific and some Azure data too, I heard, this is the event you want to check out. In person, preferably.
Absolutely.
It's been awesome, Hamish, as usual. So good to be able to talk all things ALM. I hope people get so excited by this because we've been excited by it. I have a software developer background, so I've loved ALM for 10 plus years. You've been working with it for longer than me and still have that passion for it. And for those of you who are new to it, don't be scared by it. It's okay. Start with source control, progress your way. You'll start learning about branching. It'll be scary at first, but you'll learn it over time. And you reach out to people like Hamish and I. We're there to help you. That's what we're here for.
Indeed. Collaborate with others because they'll help you and you can help them.